Okay, so I think we're going to get started. Thank you everybody for coming. My name is Brendan. I'm the coordinator from ReForest London. We're really pleased to be here co-hosting this event with Reimagine Co, with all the support from the community. Thank you guys for coming. We've got a really great guest speaker today, Mhairi McFarlane from the Nature Conservancy of Canada. She's going to give a presentation about her work, and then I'll give some remarks afterwards. So, I'll go with you.
Great, well thanks everyone for coming today. I know it's a gorgeous day outside and we probably all would rather be out gardening in the sunshine instead of cooped up in a dark room listening to me drone on, but I'll do my best to make it interesting and engaging. I know some of you have probably seen some semblance of this presentation before, so feel free to snooze if that's the case, but hopefully there'll be something exciting and interesting for all of you. So, as Brendan mentioned, my name is Mhairi McFarlane. I work for the Nature Conservancy of Canada, which I'll talk a little bit about who we are, what we are for those of you that aren't familiar, and a little bit about our work at scale, but also kind of keeping it relevant to what we're all concerned about in our own backyards today. So before I jump in, I just want to acknowledge that my position as a visitor here in Canada, and in fact even where I grew up in central Scotland, arguably I felt like a visitor there as well. There were large areas of the remote wild highlands of Scotland where people had been forcibly cleared to make way for sheep farming. And many of those people, in fact, came to Canada and represent the settlement of Canada. And since I've arrived in Canada in about 2006, I still regard myself as a visitor, and as we're becoming increasingly aware of all the amazing things we can learn from the many Indigenous communities that were here before many of us, I do my best to remain minded and continue to try to learn from all of the people that have come before us, and people are still stewarding the lands all around us. So I want to kind of acknowledge that. I have a lot to learn. I do my best to share the things that I know, and I'm excited to keep learning from all of you and others. So with that, I'll jump in. So I've got a little bit of everything, whether you're interested in plants or birds or insects or just pretty colours outside or whatever it is, then be little bits and pieces for all of you in this talk. So I'm going to start at the basics and talk a little bit about pollination. So why do plants make flowers at all? It's not actually for our enjoyment, really. Plants make flowers in order to reproduce. They contain pollen, which needs to be moved to different flowers, sometimes on the same plant, but often on a different plant. And that allows a seed to develop, which can then move and then grow into a new plant. So many of you probably know that, but it's worth just starting kind of back. What's the point of all these cool flowers that we see? And pollen can be moved around in different ways. That's essentially a problem that plants have had to evolve ways to solve, is how do I move my pollen around? And some species do it using wind and water. So this is a photo I took of the water in Lake Superior a few years ago. I was up there doing some work for an event up there. They look like someone poured paint into the water. This is actually pollen from conifer trees. And this was actually, I think, a non-native ornamental pollen in the parking lot of the hotel where we're staying. It was just giving off clouds and clouds of pollen. And the key thing here is that is the kind of stuff that makes us sneeze. So if you're unfortunate enough to have allergies, seasonal allergies, then this is the kind of pollen that causes you problems. This type of pollen is very light, it blows easily in the wind, and therefore is very easy to get up your nose. And this is important, I'll come back to this later. Other plants have evolved to take advantage of animals that will move pollen around for them. So there's some cool examples all around the world. Some of them we have right here on our doorstep. So there's small mammals, so like bats. This is a picture that I stole from the internet somewhere of a bat that's absolutely covered in pollen. Similarly, ruby-throated hummingbirds, like we see here. This is one I took in my backyard a few years ago. They drink nectar from flowers and sometimes get bits of pollen onto their feathers and then move that to another plant. And of course, many insects are really important pollinators. So bees are a common example. I'll talk about some others a little bit later. And the key thing here is that if you want to attract an animal to come and do this job for you, if you're a plant, then you need to make a big, showy, sticky flower. So if you're looking at plants and it has a really big, showy flower, maybe it's really scented, sometimes pleasantly, sometimes not, then that is a good signal that that plant is actually pollinated by an animal. And the important thing about that is that the pollen that from those plants is big and heavy and sticky, relatively speaking. So those kind of plants are very difficult for you to be allergic to. And I'll come back to why that's important later. So kind of a general divide between wind and water pollinated or animal pollinated plants. So yeah, you don't need your Kleenex for showy plants for the most part. So we've probably heard a bunch in the media over the last few years about pollinator declines. And I think it's worth understanding why insects are so incredibly important. So I think we kind of got there already. Insect pollinators are incredibly important in allowing plants to actually reproduce. So if you don't have your little insecty friend to carry your pollen around, then you can't make fruit, you can't make seeds, you can't make berries. And that has implications for other things that might like to eat those seeds and fruits and nuts and so on, including humans, obviously. So here's some more random numbers from the internet, but suffice to say that there is a huge financial value that we all benefit from having wild native insect pollinators alongside the non-native domesticated honeybees, which we'll talk about in a second. So these numbers are quite out of date now, that I suspect these values are continuing to increase, but this is kind of the estimate of what it would cost us if we didn't actually have these insects doing all this hard work for us. So it's not just a biological problem out in the wilds that we can kind of not care about, it's actually something that has huge implications for the food that you make for breakfast and how much that costs. So I mentioned already a little bit about honeybees. So honeybees are also suffering from fairly precipitous declines and challenges in various parts of the world. As a conservationist, it's worth pointing out that honeybees are a non-native domesticated animal. So in some ways they're livestock like cows and sheep are as well. So it is a problem, it's a commercial problem, but it's not directly a conservation problem here in North America that honeybees are declining. It's obviously bad if you're trying to produce honey commercially or relying on these animals for commercial gain, but it's not actually a conservation challenge per se. What is more immediately concerning from a conservation perspective is all the thousands and thousands of native insects that are also declining, some of which are pollinators. So there's around 4,000 native bee species in North America, over 400 right here in Ontario, and some of them are actually species at risk. So they're at risk of being lost to Ontario, lost from Canada, potentially lost from the world, lost to extinction. And as I say, some are actually listed as endangered. So it's worth kind of having that context when we're thinking about pollinators. Some of the kind of mainstream commercialization of bee declines are focused on honeybees, and obviously that is a problem in some cases, but it's not directly a conservation problem. So I mentioned it's not just bees. There's many insect groups that are actually really important pollinators. So this is actually a photo I took in your garden, Winnie, a few years ago. This is a very rare native tree called pawpaw. It's native to the far southern part of southwestern Ontario, so right here. Produces fruit that is edible for humans, and it's actually pollinated by things like blowflies and flies that are attracted to rotting flesh. So it emits an odor like rotten flesh and attracts things that are not bees to come and pollinate it. So just a fun little anecdote when we're harping on about bees, then there's probably a whole bunch of other things that we actually need to be worried about as well. And as I mentioned already, there's really widespread declines in insects being documented in many parts of the world now, right here in southern Ontario, but also we've seen studies coming from Europe and elsewhere in North America as well, showing pretty substantial declines in insect populations. And hopefully it leads to why we should care about that. But another reason why we need to care about that is that there's a lot of other wildlife that's dependent on those insects. So insectivorous birds, for example, are a key thing. So birds that fly around catching insects, things like swallows, the chimney swifts that we're privileged to have nesting right here in the city. All of that kind of group of birds that are dependent on insects are declining precipitously, in large part likely due to declines in insect populations. I promise this isn't all doom and gloom, by the way, it will get fine. So why do we think declining? Now there's the kind of usual reasons that are turned around, many of you are probably aware of that. So widespread use of pesticides that kill off both plants and the insects themselves. Climate change is changing all sorts of things all around us every day in ways that are very difficult to predict and even quantify sometimes. And then simple habitat loss, and that's really the thing we're going to kind of focus on today. So this is a photo I took again a few years ago down near in Scouse, Missouri, in southwestern Middlesex County. So there's this beautifully rich agricultural field here, which is producing things that are important for humans, but that's essentially representing a complete loss of habitat if you're an insect. The tiny little roadside bird here that is comprised almost entirely in this particular case of non-native plants that don't support very many insects. Where there's no food, there's no shelter, there's nowhere to raise your young if you're an insect. So that's really what we mean by habitat loss, and it's happening at lots and lots of different scales all around us. So insects are just like us in many ways. They need something to eat, they need somewhere to shelter, they need somewhere to lay their eggs, and they need somewhere to spend the winter, whether that's as an adult insect or as an egg or as a pupa, depending on what species we're talking about. They need somewhere safe and sheltered to spend our quite long winters. So just a couple of kind of notes to bring it back to birds. These are some examples of birds that are either wholly or somewhat dependent on insects at some point in their life cycle. So barn swallows, these are kind of a common household bird, if you like. They're actually ranked as threatened in Ontario. So threatened to the risk of extinction in Ontario. Now they're still relatively common, relatively widespread. If you go out, well I guess they're gone now, but if you go out 6 weeks ago you'll probably see barn swallows fairly commonly, but you won't be seeing them as commonly as you would have done 10, 20, 30 years ago. And similarly with American kestrels, these are actually a raptor, they're a small falcon. We're lucky to still have a few kicking around even in the city here. But it's interesting to think of a bird of prey actually eats insects. So these guys eat kind of big grasshoppers and some of the big beetles and things. You'll sometimes see them trying to forage along roadsides, and that's often what they're looking for. They will eat small mammals as well, but they do have quite an important insect part of their diet. So it's time to tack a little bit to talk about habitat. It's a word that we biologists like to throw around quite a lot, and we don't always take the time to define it, but it's really quite straightforward. Everything that has evolved to need a certain set of things, and that's what we call habitats. The things that provide them with what I mentioned before, somewhere to eat, food, shelter, somewhere to reproduce, somewhere to spend the winter. And a lot of these things, a lot of species are very generalist. So this is an American robin that actually laid her eggs in a traffic light. This was here in London a few years ago. It was really cool. The city put up another set of lights so that you could still see the lights and not disturb the robin. I didn't actually manage to check if she was successful in raising her chicks or not, but I thought it was kind of neat.
She's back there this year.
Is she really? Okay, cool. So I don't commute to work anymore, so I don't see her. I just work from home. So that's an example of American robin, something we're probably all quite familiar with. We'll see them all over our gardens, see them all through the city, see them in the countryside. But other things are a lot fussier. So an example might be a pileated woodpecker. Some of you might be lucky enough to have them in your garden. I'm not, I'm very jealous. But these guys are often happier when there's big tracts of forest. That's a really specific thing that they need. So if you live near Westminster Ponds, for example, you might kind of be lucky to see them in there. But the point I'm trying to make is that everybody needs different things. Some folks are quite happy with anything that you throw at them, and that's this common stuff that we tend to see in urban areas. There's a lot of other things that are much more heavily specialized, and the same is true for insects. So some insects will only be able to forage on one species of plant, and a key example of that is monarch butterflies. We're quite familiar with them. They will drink nectar from any flowering plant that happens to be flowering when they're looking for nectar. But when it comes to egg laying, they can only do that on milkweeds, and there's quite a few species of milkweed, but in that group of plants, they're completely restricted to those species if they want to reproduce. So with no milkweeds, it's quite simple, we have no monarchs. And the same is true for a gajillion other insect species, some of which we probably haven't actually described yet. So that's the link with native plants. The other thing that's important to think about is the timing. So those of you that spend time out and about all year round in the summer, you know when black flies are around, you know when mosquitoes are around, and then suddenly you know when they're not. Now the same is true for bees, other pollinators, moths, butterflies. They will be active at a very specific point in the season in some cases. When they're active, they absolutely have to have all of those things. They need somewhere to eat, they need somewhere to lay their eggs. And if that timing is kind of out of whack, which we're starting to see with climate change and habitat loss, then you have a real problem. You're going to go hungry and you're not going to be able to lay eggs. Yeah, so changing tack again slightly, this is a photo I took in, I think, Keynes Woods on the west side of London. And the specific labels don't actually matter, but the point here is that this is a really gorgeous patch of forest, and on the forest floor there were many, many different species of mostly native wild plants. So there was trout lily, there was zigzag goldenrod, there was geranium, trilliums, mayaples, and all these lovely spring plants that you get. It was really diverse. And then if you look at the tree trunks, there are lots of different species of tree as well. So trees that have short pointy leaves, trees that have big wide floppy leaves, trees that have leaves that presumably taste different if you're a caterpillar. So that was really cool. If you're a bird looking for a caterpillar to feed your nest full of chicks, then that's a really good place to be, because there's a lot of different plants supporting lots of different insects at different points in the season, and therefore lots for you to eat if you're a nesting bird. Now, unfortunately, on the other side of the trail, somebody had dumped, or a raccoon had dragged a bunch of lily of the valley, which is a really amazingly scented, very commonly grown garden plant, which I used to have in my yard. I think I've managed to kill them all, but not quite. This is a non-native plant which, when it escapes into the wild, can just go completely rampant over time. So, as you can imagine, if you're an insect looking for a flower to pollinate, at this point in time, there were no flowers at all on this whole big patch. Whereas on the other side of the trail, there were at least 3 or 4 different coloured things flowering, with different shaped flowers, different sized flowers, slightly just different nutritional values in their pollen and nectar as well, presumably. But over here, there's nothing. So this is what's happening. This is kind of one of the underlying causes of declines in insects, and therefore birds and other wildlife all around us, is a kind of homogenization of the landscape to much less in the way of acreage supporting this kind of diversity, and much more supporting very little diversity, or supporting nothing at all as any use if you're an animal. So I mentioned a little bit about climate change already, and timing. So this is a key thing that is what we're starting to see, is that birds, for example, migratory birds will come back based a little bit on weather patterns of the year, so it can vary a little bit each year, but based also on things like day length. And same with insects, that they will emerge from their little overwintering hidey hole when the day length is at a certain point, because they've evolved to know that if I emerge when there's this much daylight, then these 6 native plants will be flowering, and I will find nectar to drink and pollen to move around. If I'm a bird, I know that I can come back and eat those insects and use them to build my eggs that I'm about to lay for this season. But we're seeing mismatches in timing of all of these things, because some plants are responding to temperature. So if the spring is kind of earlier and warmer, then they will do their thing before the insects are emerging, or before the birds are back to eat the insects. And vice versa. Sometimes it can happen the other way, that with late springs, then stuff is delayed, and then birds arrive back and there's nothing to eat for that reason. So some things could just adapt and find something else to eat, but a lot of things actually can't, and that's where it starts to get really concerning, is that we can't just randomly, migrate a month later or a month earlier, because that's just not what we can do. And the other thing is that climate change can really exacerbate the spread of non-native and invasive plants and other things, so that can kind of have a double whammy with our looking at plant ecosystems. So, I have next. Actually, it's an arbitrary pretty picture for you to look at. So this is a brown-eyed Susan in my yard. Oh yeah, that. Talking about what I do, that's right. That's what comes next. So, as I mentioned, I work for the Nature Conservancy of Canada. We are Canada's largest land conservation charity. So we're a non-government organisation. We're dependent on grants. We do get grants from the government, but we're also dependent on donations from private individuals like you and I, and corporate support and so forth. And what we essentially do is we acquire land through either direct purchase of land that's for sale, or if someone wants to donate their land to us. And we're generally focused on looking for land that provides significant wildlife habitat, or increasingly, especially in southwestern Ontario, land that we can restore to once more provide that kind of habitat. And since we started in 1962, so we have a birthday coming up this fall, which should be really exciting. And since then, we've conserved around 50 million hectares right across Canada. Now I should be able to remember how that's represented, but it's kind of, I think it's several Banff National Parks worth of land that we've conserved. So it's a lot, I guess is the point. And that's through land that we've acquired, and in some cases transferred to another conservation organisation that's better positioned to take care of it. Many times we will hold on to the land and actually steward and take care of it ourselves, which is what I'm going to chat about next. So this is a map showing roughly, basically the fact that we work from coast to coast to almost to coast. These are projects that we have supported the conservation of one way or another right across the country. You see there's a huge cluster of our work right here in Ontario. And you can go out and visit these properties as you wish. Here in Ontario, zooming in a little bit, these kind of green shaded areas are areas where we try to focus our conservation effort. These are what we call natural areas, and within these there's a conservation plan that I help write for each of these areas, and that helps us work out which bits of land we think are the most important for us to try to conserve and protect with help from partners. And here in Ontario we conserved around 85,000 hectares. That number actually just increased enormously because we just acquired somewhere up here, actually no sorry, I'm telling you up here, another 150,000 hectares of land, which is the largest private conservation project in Canada's history, right here in Ontario. So that is super exciting, and as a reminder, I need to update this slide. So what are we actually doing? I mentioned all of these threats to pollinators and other animals, and unfortunately we can't fix all of the things directly. But we can address some key things that are within our mandate and therefore reduce the relative impact of some of the other threats. So as I mentioned, we take care of the land forever. We don't just buy land and then walk away. We actually have a team of professional stewardship biologists. That's how I started out at NCC, was as a field biologist, actually taking care of these properties forever. Here in southwestern Ontario, we've done a lot of restoration work, which I'll show you in a second. So taking land that has been degraded through something that humans have done, and once we're able to purchase that land, we can actually do our best to fix it up and make it better and turn it back into really quite functional wildlife habitat. So what that looks like, in the Long Point area down in Norfolk County, we've acquired quite a number of former tobacco farms. So these were properties that grew tobacco and in some cases soybeans and corn. When we purchased the farm, we would plant native seeds of lots of wildflowers and grasses and turn it into a nice meadow like this, which then supports a whole bunch of pollinators and breeding birds and cool animals. So what does it actually look like? This is us out on Peely Island in Lake Erie. We collect kind of between 20 and even up to 100 species of seeds. So we'd scrabble around in the ditches looking for acorns, we'd be stripping seeds off native grasses and things like that. Chuck it all together in a bucket and scatter it either by hand if it was a fairly small site, or we'd contract someone with a seeder or a tractor to kind of do it on a bigger scale. We often have volunteer events to help us plant acorns individually, hoping that the turkeys don't eat them all before they turn into oak trees. And yeah, but we also have volunteer events to help us plant little plugs of native plants. So this is a volunteer looking very, very happily at this tray full of big blue stem that he's been tasked with planting. So lots of ways to get involved. The other thing we do is we don't just dump a bunch of seeds on the ground, we'll also look in situations where we might be able to reconstruct habitat features that have been lost. So a lot of agricultural land in southern Ontario especially has actually been artificially flattened out and artificially drained so that it's possible to grow crops. So when we purchase the land, we actually go in and try and reverse some of that. So this is where we get to, well, I don't get to do it, unfortunately. We get to do conservation with a backhoe. So we'll go in with heavy machinery and kind of dig out areas that are naturally a little bit shallower and that we can see kind of want to be wet. And we'll try and break all of the artificial drains that are in there and then let it reflood naturally from rainfall over time. And we'll seed this area with wetland plants, so plants that you'd expect to find growing in the wild in much wetter areas. And lo and behold, we can support migratory shorebirds, we can get ducks and other waterfowl coming in remarkably quickly. Oh, sorry. And these sites are also supporting species at risk breeding turtles remarkably quickly after construction as well. So just some more images of what this can look like. So this is a tobacco field that we purchased actually just before I moved to Canada. So it would have looked a bit like this in 2006. It was planted with a mixture of kind of 70 to 100 native wildflower and tree seeds. First year, it looked terrible. There was only kind of 1 or 2 slightly weedy species that had established. And this was the first time we'd done this, so everyone was very nervous. But the following year and several years thereafter, it looked a lot like this, with all the native plants that established a little bit more slowly than some things. These are actually oak trees that were planted as acorns in 2006. By 2013, there were already trees that were bigger than me. There's gaps in between the plants. It's actually a really sandy soiled area. So these open patches of sand are actually really important for some of our native pollinators. So there's some bee species, for example, that actually nest in sand like that. So sometimes you'll see some bees and bee mimics and things flying around, and they'll grab little katydids or caterpillars, and they will take them back and bury them in little sandy tunnels and lay their eggs in or near the insect prey that they've got, and that's how the insects get their first meal when they hatch out. So these kind of patches of open ground are actually quite important, as well as the plants that grow nearby. We had a PhD student that did her work on this particular site, and she found 100 species of bee within 2 or 3 years after it was a tobacco field. So it's quite a remarkable transformation just by jamming in a bunch of native plants. We're lucky with such incredibly intense growing seasons down here in southern Ontario that we can have this kind of success that we can actually document in the wildlife that shows up remarkably quickly. So we're also looking at, as we keep doing this, we keep learning from it, we keep learning from expertise and local communities that have input to this. And we're still trying to work on maximizing native plant diversity at some of these sites. And also looking at making sure that we're installing very specific plant species in order to support very specific insects that really need our help. So a key example would be mottled dusky wing is a nice little brown butterfly. You may have seen on the news it was successfully reintroduced to the Pinery Provincial Park last year. So they reintroduced, I think, adults and pupae last summer, spent the whole winter biting our nails to see if they would survive the winter and pop up again, and they actually did. So the next stage may in fact be to try and reintroduce mottled dusky wing on some Nature Conservancy of Canada properties as well, which is stupidly exciting. We've been reinstalling plants for years, but now we get to do an animal, which is really fun. And we've been doing a bunch of monitoring to make sure that we have enough of the species that particular butterfly really needs. So they need New Jersey tea, they need lupin. We also, of course, plant lots of milkweed species to support monarchs and so forth. Down the line, it would be really cool to look at perhaps reintroducing the Kerner blue butterfly. So that's a little blue butterfly that's actually extinct in Canada. It used to be here all around us in southwestern Ontario, but it's gone because of habitat loss. And we're kind of getting to the point where we maybe just about have recreated and managing enough habitat that it may actually be relevant to be having that discussion about reintroducing that to Canada, which I hope I can kind of be working for long enough. It may not happen within my career at NCC, but I'm hoping to lay some groundwork to make it relevant to my successor perhaps. So bringing this back to you guys, this might seem kind of irrelevant to you, but hopefully it's fun and exciting. Now, if you're like me and you don't have a 200-acre field to go and restore, then you can still do a lot of stuff that is really very much the same as what I just described NCC doing, just at a smaller scale. So using native plants is really one of the key things that we can all do to support native insects and hence birds and other wildlife. Even if you just have a balcony and you have space for a plant, then if you choose a native plant that works well in a pot, so something probably drought resistant, something that doesn't have a giant root system depending on how much space you have, you can still actually support just a little bit of insect biodiversity by selecting a native plant rather than a non-native plant. It's worth avoiding cultivars. So-called nativars are cultivars of native plants that have been bred to perhaps be slightly better behaved or to be slightly different in color, that kind of thing. And they're the research on those is somewhat mixed. Some are okay, some are completely useless if you're an insect trying to find habitat. So wherever possible, I always recommend people just get the real thing. There's a whole bunch of real things just outside the door, which I'm super excited to see. So I have a few examples here of some well-behaved, relatively well-behaved native plants. This one actually right here, this happens to be a photo I took on a restored field on Keeley Island. Hairy beard tongue. It's actually a beautiful, really well-behaved, only grows about this tall. It flowers in early summer, but I have one in my yard that's actually flowering right now, so I don't know if he's a bit confused or if he's like, hey, you know, I'm going to pretend it's spring again. I will also mention that if you're lucky enough to, say, live near an existing natural area, or maybe you have a cottage a little further north in Ontario, then look around you and see what's already there. There are some incredible native plants that are growing in remarkably disturbed areas sometimes here in Ontario. So admittedly, these are photos I took on kind of wilderness canoe trips in northern Ontario over the last few years. But many of these species do actually grow in, I should move that so you can see the label, pink lady slipper. These are plants that obviously you should not go and dig up plants from the wild and move them. But if you have a cottage somewhere that is in more of a kind of wilderness or more of an intact environment, you may well already have some of these cool things just growing around the edges of your property. So bear that in mind. So down here, these are all things I have in my yard here in London. I'm in suburban western London. Prairie smoke is one of my favoritist plants. These are all plants that are good for dry, hot, sunny spots in your yard. Prairie smoke, I shovel snow, salty snow onto my prairie smoke the whole winter and have done for 15 years. And every spring it pops its little head out and does this for me, and then it makes cool seeds like this. So it's a really easy to grow native plant, really good for long driveways or walkways and things like that. Butterfly weed is another great one. This is one of the milkweed plants that will actually support monarch butterflies. I've included the scientific name here, not to show off and be all fancy schmancy and sciencey, but because if you're out buying plants in nurseries, then beware of the common names, because common names are often meaningless. There are a lot of plants with butterfly in the title, butterfly plant, butterfly weed, butterfly bush. Some of those are non-native, some of those are invasive, some of those are not any use for insects for their entire life cycle. So if you're keen to get kind of the real deal, then take the time to kind of check for the scientific name and check that it is actually a native plant. This is a photo from last summer. You can see how much care and attention I give to my lawn. It's great all summer, I ignore it. If it's nice and dry and crispy like last year, then it dies, I don't have to cut it, it's perfect. But I gave the butterfly weed exactly the same level of attention. So I didn't water it, I didn't do anything to it, and yet it was green and vibrant. It was absolutely covered in these incredible orange flowers last summer and again this year. So it's a really great example of a plant that's really happy in really quite harsh conditions without any love and care. If you've got some shadier spots, like many of us have here in the city of London, then bluestem goldenrod is one of my favourite native woodland goldenrods. Now if you remember right back at the beginning, I had some slides about pollen, and if you've got bright, vibrant flowers like this, then it means that you've got pollen that's designed to hook onto a bee or some other animal. It's not going to float around and make you sneeze. So it's one of these common urban legends that goldenrod causes allergies. It does not. Wild columbine is another favourite of mine. This is the native wild type of columbine. There's lots of non-native and cultivar versions of columbine, but this is the one that you want if you want to support wildlife here in London. This is a big patch of mine. My groundhogs then dug it all up, so it doesn't look nearly as nice this year, but it can be quite a show-stopping plant if you have a big patch of it. This is what I did to my front yard a few years ago. It's a really small patch, but the point of this is to illustrate how many different native plants you can jam into a remarkably small area here in London. I created a rain garden here, so this bit is actually, we dug a hole and lined it with pond liner, and we're catching the water off our roof. So in here I can grow wetland plants like this gorgeous cardinal flower, and a few other things, whereas around the side it's actually quite droughty, so I can grow different species of wildflower that are actually quite happy in the dry. So this is back when it used to be tidy. It's not as tidy now, unfortunately. But point being that you can jam in an awful lot of incredibly beautiful native wildflowers in a really small area. There's lots and lots of different colours to choose from. If you have a passion for pink, or a passion for yellow, or a passion for white, or a passion for a whole mixture, then you're going to be able to find a native plant that does that for you. The other thing to bear in mind is winter. We are at that, I keep joking that, it's not fall, there's just a few drought-stricken trees appearing, it's still summer. I guess it's not still summer. But at this point in the year, then there's an awful lot of pressure, it seems, to go out and rake your leaves and cut down seed heads and tidy everything up. Every time you do that, you're basically killing insects. Let's be blunt here. So there's an awful lot of little creatures that are in that dead plant material, either eggs or pupae, or sometimes adults that are just hanging out there in stands, hoping that you're going to leave them alone for the winter. So obviously you will often need to move stuff off walkways and entrances and things like that, but do treat it as a little living ecosystem, if you like, and find ways to leave as much of that stuff as possible. Don't mulch it up, don't jam it in bags to get it trucked away to landfill using a whole bunch of carbon. See if you can find somewhere in your yard where you can kind of keep as much of that stuff. I'm privileged that I have a fair amount of space, even though I have a suburban backyard, so I have a giant pile of kind of mess at the back, which nobody can really see, so no one's really complained about it, and I appreciate that not everyone has that opportunity. But do think about the fact that all of these bits of dead plants are actually full of little animals. And some of the seed heads are actually really beautiful. This is Virgin's Bower, which is a native clematis. I brought one to give away today. The seed heads isn't really a great picture of it, but the seed heads are absolutely beautiful, and they will persist throughout the whole winter and give you some kind of interest in your garden for the winter. Yes, I'm just going to have a couple of quick slides to wrap up on a slightly different topic, but actually not a different topic. So native plant gardening is a really good thing that we can all do. There's a couple of other things that we can do as well if we're concerned about some of the bird declines I mentioned. So there's an awful lot of things that kill birds every single year here in Canada. One thing is wind turbines, which there's various different estimates for all of these. These are from a reputable peer-reviewed source. I can't remember exactly which one it is off the top of my head. There are about 16 million birds are killed by wind turbines annually in Canada. Another thing that kills birds, and this is happening right now as birds migrate, is that they smack into our windows and our glass railings around our swimming pools and on our balconies and all that kind of thing. That's estimated to kill about 22 million birds annually in Canada, which is still a really horrifically large number. But these numbers are completely irrelevant compared with what these guys do. So cats that go outdoors, including cats that are well-fed, cuddly-friendly house cats, kill about 200 million birds in Canada every single year. And there's various parameters around these estimates. So all of these estimates kind of give or take 5 or 10%, depending on which source you're looking at. But the relative magnitude of all of these threats is very consistent across many different studies. So as it happens, this is Kitty McCatface, who is no longer an outdoor feral cat. He's now thoroughly contained on a leash and a catio, so he does not kill any birds anymore. But really my point is that if you're going to have a native plant garden to support wildlife and you let your cat outdoors, then you're kind of wasting your time to some extent. I know it's hard and I hate to be so blunt about it, but it is a really serious conservation issue that we can actually all control relatively easily. Now I have 4 former feral cats, so I know it's not entirely easy, but it is certainly something to kind of bear in mind in the context of all of the conservation challenges that we're all seeing all around us. So bits and pieces you can all do if you're so inclined, then do consider supporting conservation organisations. I happen to work for the Nature Conservancy of Canada. There's a local land trust called the Thames Talbot Land Trust, which does very similar work on a more local scale. There's many other local organisations and broader organisations that do this kind of habitat protection restoration work that are all desperate for support, whether it's in the form of your time to come and volunteer or even just share messaging. Financial donations are always hugely welcomed, of course. But coming out to volunteer events and helping us do this kind of work as well is incredibly valuable to us. Do what you can to contain your cats. This is my catio that my husband had lots of fun building. It's quite ramshackle, but the pussycats really like it. They can kind of come out and see birds and see the leaves falling and experience the temperatures outdoors, but they're not causing anyone any harm. If you're out and about hiking in a natural area or a semi-natural area, another key thing that you can do if you're a doggy person is to keep your dog on a leash. Dogs off leash are really bad for people that are scared of dogs, which there are many. It's also really bad for wildlife. They cause a lot of disturbance to birds and wildlife that might be hanging out. Birds right now are migrating through. Some of them are flopping down, resting on the ground. And every time they're disturbed by your off-leash dogs and they're using precious energy, that means they're not going to get to their wintering ground safely. And yeah, the other thing that you can do, and I think there are some samples up there, is to bird safe your windows. So you can just see behind the dozer here, I've got all these little blobs on my kitchen window. So these are little stickers that go on the outside of the glass. I can't really see them looking out for the most part. You can see them a little bit, but it's not too bad. But on the outside, they make it visible enough that birds don't fly into the windows anymore. It's a little bit fiddly to do. It's worth doing it on a nice warm, calm day. It's worth having two people because you need to kind of hold both ends of the strips of the things. But it's a really a relatively easy thing that we can do as long as you can actually reach your windows or if you've got those glass railings. Then I strongly recommend putting some kind of markings on the outside. It needs to be very close together. Your kind of random falcon stickers aren't really going to do anything. It needs to be close enough together that a little bird, like a hummingbird or a chickadee, can see that it can fit through. So yeah, so these are all things that we can all be doing. I've done all of these things at my place. And depending on your situation, you can probably do some or all of these things over time. To wrap up just quickly with a real life project, this is something I'm super excited about. We just finished this project on Peely Island. We've created this big wetland on a farmer soybean field. It was a 62-acre soybean field, like up on the left here. We acquired this property many years ago and we went renting it out to the farmer until we had the resources to do the restoration. It's now a series of ponds and shorebird zones and upland meadow habitat that's already starting to support a bunch of wildlife. This is kind of a bird's eye view of a map of it. So this is an existing forest. This was the agricultural field that we've restored. So there's some deeper ponds, there's some shallower ponds. And what I'm particularly excited about is that there's a trail going to go along here and a bird viewing blind that we're actually constructing right now so that you can come and sit in relative comfort and look at birds and other wildlife on this site without disturbing them and without getting your feet wet. So that's a site out on Peely Island that you're welcome to go visit. I'd recommend taking a trip next spring when the ferry starts running and see if you can explore that. So this is a picture my parents took of a bird hide somewhere in Europe, I think. This is the kind of thing that we're starting to get a little bit better at on Nature Conservancy of Canada properties, is trying to provide the infrastructure that allows us to welcome people a little bit more safely and comfortably to properties where that makes sense. So do look us up on the internet and come and visit our properties. And with that, I will stop talking and take any questions, but also excited to hopefully that many of you will go home with a bunch more native plants, some of which came from my garden. I think ReForest London donated a bunch of plants, I think Brian mentioned. So yeah, thanks for listening.